Welcome to Board Gems. In this video I'll be comparing two editions of the same game published by Arcane Wonders and designed by Emerson Matsuuchi. The game is called Foundations of Rome, at least that was the original that came out in 2022, which was crowdsourced only. Maybe could also have been bought from Arcade Wonders' website, not sure. And the follow-up Foundations of Metropolis, which is the retail version. It came out 2024. Here you can see them side by side, and you can see the difference immediately. Foundations of Rome has tons of plastic miniatures, which is why it needs a big giant box, whereas the Foundations of Metropolis remake uses thick but ultimately flat cardboard tiles. I usually describe the Foundations of Rome box as a cube, but that's not quite right. It's actually really deep in one dimension. Yet another game that seems to be made with the assumption that the owner has an IKEA Kallax shelf. You can see it nicely nestles in to one of the Kallax cubes. End in, so the longer dimension, it takes up the depth of the Kallax cube, and a tiny little space above for a very good game like Condottieri. Backs of the boxes. You know, these games are only 2 years apart, but they still show a sort of a difference in presentation that's happened recently on the backs of boxes. Whereas in the 2022 edition, you have a gameplay state, but also a bunch of text just basically saying how amazing the experience is, why this game is special. And in the newer edition, you have a kind of a zoomed in view and a much simplified wording, where there's a little bit of text on the bottom, and it's mostly showing what's very common now is like a step process. A game like this might show, the steps you do on your turn, in this case, one of the 3 actions that you can do on your turn. But the point is to keep the text limited, and if the text is describing how you play, then keeping the text limited will give the impression that the game is very simple. For what it's worth, the game is very simple. Okay, let's unbox this bad boy. This whole cover slides up to reveal the gooey contents inside. 5 trays of player pieces. This edition comes with the 5th player expansion. Very few people on Kickstarter just got the basic edition, which was 4 players. Most got the special edition that supported 5 players and an extra Monuments expansion. I keep the styrofoam here just to keep pressure off of the bottom tray, but the bottom tray is the Monuments, which I'll show again at the end. This is an expansion that was included in the most commonly backed pledge level. And on the side here we have everything else, the player boards and money and cards, etc. There's a plastic tray that keeps everything in its place. So you got a couple of different boards here, the Rulebook. One thing to note is that this is actually not the original plastic tray, because I later on backed the Foundations of Rome expansion called Roads of Fortune. And as part of the expansion, they included a replacement plastic tray so that it has room for all these bits and the new expansion content, which is a great way to do it. It's a little bit tight if you want to keep everything. Like I have the metal money and the cardboard money both in the tray, but there is room for everything. The player pieces are kept in a tray, which the player keeps in front of them. Has a little plastic lid to keep everything in its place. It does make it a little challenging to put it away because everything has to be in the right spot. And there's even secondary plastic trays to keep the little bits in place. The 8 larger bits are used to reserve plots of land on the board. The top 6 are used in the expansion Roads to Fortune. But you can see the 3D bits here. Let's unpack Foundations of Metropolis. So you got the plastic lid keeping the contents inside. Player boards on top. Those tiles are extra thick, and the trays they go on are double layer. They're very easy to get in and out. The deed board, the scoring board, the board where it all happens, and another plastic tray to keep the remaining bits in place. There's dedicated wells for the cards and the player pieces, and just kind of some generic wells for the money. 2 player trays side by side. They are equivalent. They're even laid out the same way. That board on the right is a double layered board, and the tiles representing the buildings are extra thick, and they nestle in there so like half of the tile sticks out, and it's still easy to get them out because you can't really see it well in the photo, but most if not all of these little spaces for tiles have a little gap in the second layer that allows you to get your finger in there and lift the tile out. The buildings are equivalent. I should point out that the buildings on the left are not standard. I splurged on the Sundrop coating, which is kind of a dark but clear coating, and it kind of collects along the corners and edges, which makes the lines and edges, the borders, really stand out and pop. It does also make them look a little bit dirty. It's kind of a cool effect. If I had the time back, I'm not sure I would have spent the extra money on it, but it's neat. The original had different shades of buildings, kind of beige, brown, and gray, representing different types of buildings, residential, commercial, or civic. And I do like that the buildings themselves look kind of neutral, and then the player colors are just these icons. It makes the city itself look a little bit more cohesive. You could see on the right that they have the player colors in the hex, but also the buildings themselves are the player colors. It makes the overall result of the board more colorful. It doesn't mean that the hexes, which have these little icons on them, and the player colors, those don't really stand out as much when they're nestled in among the same player color represented in the building. A minor point. These are the player pieces. Let's start with the newer one. Foundations of Metropolis on the right uses wooden tokens in colors which I think work pretty well for colorblind people. I'm not colorblind, but I feel like these colors should work well. Nicely, they have different shapes for the different players, although that doesn't help you for the score cubes in the foreground. On the left, in the background, you have the sculpted reservation markers. So again, all different shapes, which is good. And in the foreground are the original scoring cubes that you used in Foundations of Rome. But because it's possible that they have to sit on top of one another, there's always the risk that the cubes could fall over. So later on, Arcade Wonders made available these little extra scoring markers that look like little 1x1 Lego bricks that can stack on top of each other with little risk of them falling over. First player markers in both regular editions, they're cardboard discs. You kind of don't really need a first player marker, really. You don't have to remember at the end of the round or game who started. You don't play an even number of turns necessarily. Anyway, as an extra in the Kickstarter campaign, you got this cool metal figure as a replacement start player marker. Completely unnecessary. This game doesn't need a first player marker at all, much less a metal first player marker, but I mean, it's nice. The money. Foundations of Rome had cardboard money, which is in the middle, and you could also get metal coins on the left, 1s and 3s. In the metal coins, the 3s are polished and the 1s are kind of dulled, and that's what makes them stand out from each other. And in Foundations of Metropolis, values 1, 3, and 5, slightly different sizes and different colors. Not much to say about the cards. These show the spots on the board that you will be reserving when you buy these. In Foundations of Rome, they're in different colors and also different colored corners to represent the different player counts that you might use these cards in. And in Foundations of Metropolis, there's just a little text underneath that says, 2+ players, 3+ players, 4 players. On the bottom, we see the player aid, basically the same thing. And on the bottom edges, you see the backs of the cards. This is the deed board, or lot board. This is the board that you store the cards on, and you can buy a card for the price above it. As lots or deeds are purchased, the more expensive ones become cheaper in a sort of sliding value market that first started in Show Manager. These are effectively identical. The Foundations of Metropolis one is a tiny bit smaller, but not importantly so. And the scoring boards also aren't really appreciably different from each other. In both versions, they are double layered, so each number has a little space that you can nestle the scoring cube in. They did replace the concept of victory points with prestige. Ooh, don't you want prestige? It's still victory points. Foundations of Rome goes up to 5 players, technically with a 5th player expansion, but I think this board comes with the regular edition too. They just made the same board for all versions. So you can see it has a scaling grid for the number of players. 2 players is white, then if you had 3 players, you're into the cyan, and then kind of a lilac, a lovely lilac for 4 players, and then getting into a bit of a red for 5 players. Foundations of Metropolis only goes up to 4. I do like the city border around the playfield. They're double-sided boards. They have smaller playfields for fewer players on the back. Not technically necessary, but looks a little nicer. So in Foundations of Rome, it's 2 or 3 players, and in Foundations of Metropolis, this is the 2-player only side. In both versions, you can play with fewer numbers on the larger board. This is purely aesthetic to have this. Foundations of Rome's rulebook is large because it also includes a bunch of expansion content. In various places it has this lady, Aurelia, kind of making various points and things to look out for. Sometimes she's smiling and sometimes she's stern. So really I do get kind of a teacher vibe from her. Pretty clear, a little intimidating though because it's so big. It also includes details on the monuments expansion, some additional content, some additional modules that you can play with, which do not appear in Foundations of Metropolis. It even has lore. I think lore is a weird way to phrase it. I mean, I know these buildings are not real. You know, they're artistic renderings of buildings that could have been made in the Roman Empire, but I don't know, calling them lore is, to me, suggests it's kind of mythological, and it is still Rome, isn't it? Yeah, that's nice. Foundations of Metropolis, by necessity, has a thinner rulebook because it doesn't have any expansion and module content, but as a result, actually looks and feels a little bit clearer. No Aurelia to scold you. Both rulebooks have a little map showing you how to put things back in their right place on your player trays, which is appreciated. And finally, this is the Monuments expansion, only available in Foundations of Rome. Not clear if they'll do an expansion for Metropolis, not at the time of recording. This technically is not included in the basic version of Foundations of Rome, but almost everybody who backed it got the bigger version with the 5th player expansion and this. Monuments, very cool looking. Black is not a player color, instead these are neutral buildings that have particular conditions that need to be met in order to build them, and players obviously need the space on the board, but also need to meet those conditions, and then they can build these. And that will give them some extra benefit. If you're worried about variety, which I'm not, but if you were worried about variety in the game, this adds quite a bit because you won't use all of them every game. If you throw in the Monuments expansion, you'll just use some, and you can use a different set every time you play. Thank you for watching and for listening to my voice. Not old games at all, like Foundations of Rome, don't stop being good. I mean, they didn't have time to stop being good, did they? Okay, great. Take care. Merry Christmas, etc.